I'll try and speak a little softer than that noise. Good morning. Thank you, Chris. Why don't we just skip all the conversation and go sit outside and enjoy the day? It's such a beautiful day, isn't it? What I think I would like to do, first of all, good morning, I'm Fernando de Sousa. I run an initiative for Microsoft called Microsoft for Africa. It's something that we launched at the beginning of this year, February 2013. My history with Microsoft is a little longer than that. I've spent 22 years in the company. And I've worked in Africa, the Middle East, India, China, and for a very short period of time in the United States, because it bored me to tears, and I ran away and went and looked for an emerging market where people were really trying to do things that mattered, as opposed to just make money. I think I'm fortunate in the sense that after spending about 4 years running Microsoft in Saudi Arabia, which in itself is a challenge, which most of us would try and avoid if we could, I was asked to run this initiative. And so what I wanted to do today is spend a little bit of time and talk about Microsoft for Africa, but not in the sense of what it is for Microsoft, but what it is for the continent of Africa, and what it is that we think and how we see and how we've informed our dialogue with the continent over 20 years or 22 years in sharing the lessons that we've learned. What I also then want to do is kind of talk to you a little bit about a concept where we are trying to think of two words, relevance and impact. And so as we build, as the continent builds its solutions, as it builds and develops applications and services and so on, what creates relevance, and how is it that Africa is going to take advantage of not so much the platform, not so much the technology, not so much the device, but actually can take advantage of what Africa needs, which essentially are solutions that I think address two fundamental problems. The first one is wealth creation, and I think we need to think about technology, and I think that's, as we've tried to build Microsoft for Africa, to think about what is Africa, right? And I've taken the liberty of using some of the statistics actually that come out of your organization, just to try and frame a little bit of the discussion. My bigger concern is this one, the workforce, the size of the workforce that Africa is creating for itself, which in a way is an interesting statistic. Imagine having the world's largest workforce. So when sometimes the discussion centers around, schools and education, at least from our perspective, that is not the fundamental challenge. The fundamental challenge is that there is already a number of education processes. There's already, and there will be in 5 years, 500 million people in Africa who have an education. What they won't have is jobs. Because the similar statistics that are coming out of the market today are telling us that there will be probably somewhere in the region of 320 million jobs. Now, the consequence socially, politically, economically, to the world of having 160 or 200 million young people who've gone through the trouble of actually educating themselves, who've taken that opportunity, and yet cannot generate any income, cannot actually actively contribute to the economy, I think is a problem that's much, much bigger than whether somebody wants to use one of these because it runs Windows, which is what I do, or somebody wants to use one that runs iOS or Android. I don't know that that's really the point of the conversation. And so what we've tried to do to frame the discussion is to think about what is it that Microsoft should be doing, could be doing, ought to be doing around taking the work that we do, our research, our relationships, our partnerships, perhaps the economic power that we have in the world, and bringing that as a catalyst or an enabler, or any one of the many different actions that we can take that allow Africa to then benefit and do what it needs to do with that. And so to that end, we sort of, as conceptually designing and thinking about it, we thought, okay, Let's think devices and services in this case I'm referring to cloud-enabled, web-based, hosted. Again, we can pick any one of the many words that people use, but essentially a service that enables Africans to deal with what I think is fundamentally the second problem, which is that of economic development. And I want to create the distinction between, in the previous slide, you saw 6 of the top 10 fastest growing economies are in Africa. If you go to the top 30, there's 16 or 17, and they keep changing. Ethiopia is growing faster than the United States. Well, that's not hard, but anyway, you know, it's a very, very different level of economy. And I think that's what one needs to really think about, is not so much the growth of the economy, but the development of that economy. In other words, are those structures, are those systems, are those mechanisms really developing that enable the participants in these economies to take full advantage of them? As we designed Microsoft for Africa, the sort of picture that always comes into my mind is I think about a young person in the Western world, or Japan, for that matter, Australia, who has an idea, has a very high probability of seeing that idea become a wealth creation opportunity, right? Because there are mechanisms, there are infrastructure processes, there are the means with which a young person can take that idea and turn it into something that earns a living, at least, or turns them into multi-billionaires. In Africa, ideas, of which there are an astonishing amount. It's probably the single most gratifying thing. I don't know how many of you spend your lives on aeroplanes flying around the African continent, but that's what I do. And it's amazing, you know. Having come from Mozambique, I was born in Mozambique, and I saw my own country disappear into a quagmire of disaster for so many years. And yet when I go back, people smile. The young people are astonishing in their enthusiasm, their desire to participate. And I think that that's fundamentally the biggest change that we've seen in Africa, is Africans are no longer saying, please, can I have? They are saying, I want. I want to do. I want to participate. I want to engage. And so perhaps success, as we look at it from Microsoft's perspective, and thus we focused on 2 very specific audiences, the youth and the small medium enterprises, is that these audiences start to realize that opportunity, which is to take an idea and earn money. Take a concept and turn it into economic development. And so that in turn creates jobs. So we're back to the same conversation, which is how are we using technology purely as the enabler to create wealth and to create jobs? Right? I know one is connected to the other, but that's the economic development, because wealth creation is a function of economic development, and then employability is a function of people taking their ideas and turning them into something that's meaningful. We could then add global competitiveness, we could add skills development and so on, but I think fundamentally that's what we're looking at. So as we've developed Microsoft for Africa, it's not corporate social responsibility, it's not charity, although I do and actively engage with the Gates Foundation, and Microsoft has its own corporate social responsibility initiatives. I do not run any kind of philanthropy in my team. What I do is I run business development opportunities, and right up front, the ultimate objective as far as my boss is concerned is that how much more software can Microsoft sell by doing this. So we make no excuses about that. Nothing to your point. This is a commercial. I think Africa deserves to be given the opportunity to demonstrate its commercial capabilities and its business entrepreneurship rather than its ability to consume philanthropy. So although there's a lot of partnerships with many of the funding organizations, be it the European Union or the World Bank or USAID, these are not about philanthropy, and I think it's important. So as we thought about these audiences, we thought to bring to these audiences 3, call them execution pillars, if you will. And the first one is around innovation. And since I'm going to spend a little bit more time on it in my next slide, I won't cover it right now. Let me focus on the other 2. The second one of world-class skills. I referred to the workforce and the size of the workforce. We take a view that the majority of the existing workforce, the level of institutional capability that exists today in Africa, is inadequate from a global competitiveness perspective. and it's inadequate to actually avail itself from those opportunities that are created in Africa today. How many governments do we know that end fiscal years with surplus capital? Because the employees in those government departments do not have the capability to spend the money. They don't understand simple things like business administration, budget administration, project management. Okay, so I think that's perhaps an area. So as we look at world-class skills, that's what we believe is an investment that we want to make. So we have an academy, we created an academy, and we are focused very, very heavily on building capacity from an execution perspective in the existing workforce. And that be it, we run a School of Government program. So there's a public sector aspect of this as well. I have a group in my team that does policy. And so we focus again on trying to educate governments. Give you an example, which is intellectual property, trustworthy computing, safety, cybersecurity. You know, bring an entire country or an entire continent online without understanding the impact of security on the web, of trustworthy computing, of policy that governs the ownership of intellectual property by all the wonderful developers in Africa who are going to build fantastic mobile solutions, and there's no economic development. Because what there is anarchy. And so a lot of the work we do with government is to teach them from, in some countries, teaching the Ministry of Justice to write the law that protects their own developers and their own intellectual property, to prosecuting, to cybersecurity and so on. The second part of the world-class skills for us is our own IT industry. And just some data. So as Microsoft, over 20-some years of building a business in Africa, it's a big business. We have 26 offices, we have a few thousand people, we sell a few $1 billion worth of software in Africa. There's nothing wrong, and we grow double-digit every single year. We do what any corporation does. You know, we do our business. However, that ecosystem that we work with, our partners, system integrators, application developers, that whole ecosystem around Microsoft is about 12,000 African companies. So one would argue and say, wow, that's not bad. 12,000 small enterprises in Africa doing IT business. Those companies also employ about 160,000 individuals. They're not Microsoft employees, they're not Microsoft customers, they are professionals who deliver solutions on a Microsoft platform. Our economic impact studies that we do every year indicate that that ecosystem generates about $8 for every $1 that Microsoft generates. So assume for a moment that we're talking upwards of $10 billion, maybe 12, we could argue the number. Not bad. That same ecosystem in Europe, Western Europe, employs 2 million people. Okay, and that's the tragedy. And so that's my focus around the world-class skills, is to actually enable a few million people in Africa to be employed and deliver services through that IT ecosystem. And so that means that the consumption's gone up, the creation of technology and knowledge and the digital economy has significantly increased in Africa, because there is capability not only to develop the services, but also to consume the services. And I think public sector is probably a perfect place. How many of us have gone into government offices and watched with despair the little PC that sits in the corner with maybe some screensaver from the 1980s or 90s meandering across the screen, and nobody knows what to do with it? Or schools. How many schools are there on the continent that have computer labs, which are basically dust-gathering devices that nobody knows what to do with? Because the teachers don't know what to do with it, because there's no digital education. I mean, I could go on and on and on. So our focus on world-class skills is taking the practical approach and saying, what do we do to make this ecosystem work? Affordable access, which is the third pillar of our execution, is our view that says, do not sell cheap solutions, devices, and services in Africa, because Africans, A, don't deserve it, and B, don't want them. But actually, let's drive affordability, and let's drive a conversation that is about affordability. And so affordability comes in many ways. And there's a session later today that talks about creative funding and financing. And I think that that's part of what we are trying to think about. The other part of this is delivery of services. Last week we launched here in South Africa something called Biz for Africa, which is essentially an aggregation of freemium services, online services to small medium enterprises. And we have about 220 something service providers in that service, and we are really moving forward. We're launching Morocco next month, we'll do Kenya, then Nigeria, and we'll continue to do this. So again, bringing the local ecosystems into play. When we launched Microsoft for Africa, we set ourselves 3 targets, and these targets are 2016 targets. So 1 million SMEs online, which not because we give them a PC with a GSM, with a 3G card, but actually the business ethic of these SMEs is the consumption, the utilization, and the exploitation of online services. So they become part of the digital economy. And so that was the launch of Biz for Africa, but that's essentially the motion that we're putting in place. So that means all the services have to be available in Africa by Africans that are relevant to Africans. And so, the simple thing of in a village, I'll relay this example, just something. So we did a project with TV White Spaces Technology in Kenya. Some of you may be aware of it. We set up the internet, we set up the connectivity, we set up electricity. And the chief of the village, first comment he made, we could probably sell our goats for more money now. Because until now, we can only sell the goat to the people who come to the village. This is out in the Maasai. So, but they know the problems with our goats because they live in the neighborhood. So they don't give us a lot of money. So now over the internet, we can sell the goats to the village far away. And since they don't know the problem with the goat, they'll pay us more money. Okay. True entrepreneurship. Okay. He wasn't intimidated by the internet and the screens and the PCs. He was just thinking, I can get somebody to give me more money for my goat. And that's, I think, to us was a very simple reality check about, online services. Devices, and I want to talk a little bit about devices in a second, but we do not believe, and I certainly don't believe, that it's about the device. It's about the service. It's about the economic opportunity. And then the 200 Africans is my view of taking 160,000 of my existing ecosystem and doubling it over 3 years. Because somehow we need to really just get some momentum going, because I really want to get to the 2 or 3 million, but I need to be realistic. Also, if I put 2 or 3 million as a target, my boss would probably hold me to it, and then I wouldn't get a bonus for the next 3 years, which isn't such a good idea. So let me talk a little bit about innovation and how we saw innovation. And there's a couple of things that we've really, from a sort of a thinking perspective, tried to work on. And I want to refer to something that we call the app factory. In building applications, the trend around the world, I think, has become that anybody can build an app. Right? Any young kid can go read a book, build an app. Phone app, tablet app, a web app. How many people are making money from building apps? Not that many. Because you can get 180,000 apps that tell you the weather. Although we don't really need them, just look out the window. But nobody's making money out of these. So our thinking was to actually create factories and start to treat the process of building applications. And this resonates very, very well with local government authorities. It resonates very well with local business leaders. Because the tendency has been in Africa to say, oh, you come, you build a factory, and we make things. Well, that's expensive and generally prone to failure for many reasons. On the other hand, you have young people full of ideas. You have the internet. You have some technology platform. And you have some principles and basic structures. You can create a factory that does and develops applications for the benefit of consumers who do want to buy them. Because these applications essentially do address those needs that the community has. And so over the last 8 or 9 months, what's evolved is South African App Factory is doing business-to-business type of apps. Very interesting how the sort of mindset goes. The App Factory in Cairo is almost exclusively producing social apps. The team in Cairo think, I mean, this is all, they just do social apps. The one that I thought was the most interesting was one of the girls, and we use young people, built an app which is connected to Facebook, which is a harassment tracking application. And so women are being harassed in the streets of Cairo ever since the revolution at a rate which is actually quite alarming. And so the application, phone-based application, just allows the lady to take a photo of her environment, the potential assailant that she's facing, and it almost instantaneously transmits information that says, in this location in Cairo there's a problem, and this is what the person looks like who's creating a problem. When the most recent case in India happened, that the young lady was murdered and raped, we had an approach from the Indian government to say, could we buy that application? Because that would be something that we would like to use. I think many of us are familiar with Ushahidi in Kenya, similar kinds of scenarios. So there are many of these applications that start off as social applications and yet will actually develop and become part of the fiber, of the actual fiber of the community, and can actually generate income as well. Kenya is a business to consumer application factory. We're seeing all the wonderful entrepreneurial spirit of the Kenyans just kind of think, you know, how can we do crowdsourcing and all the other wonderful things? And then Nigeria, what do we think? Entertainment, music. Okay, and it's starting, so again, what we're seeing is just a way of bringing things together. And together with that, we bring a lot of the hubs. So we have a number of conversations and relationships with hubs. The last piece of the innovation puzzle that I want to talk about is we recognize that access to finance is one of the biggest barriers to innovation and to economic development in Africa, both at the level of small enterprise and more specifically within the IT industry. And so within my team, I have a group of people that focus on creating an investment climate. And so we've created an emerging markets fund of funds because we're partnering with a number of other organizations. The fund at the moment stands at about $250 million. Our intent is to use this in combination with various other organizations, and we launched, I think last week or the week before, together with a Kenyan organization called MPH 88, an accelerator in Kenya to start to put money into the market. A couple of things which are important to understand. Microsoft doesn't take equity in these organizations. We're not going out and actually buying equity. What we're trying to do is use the funds to incubate, seed, and then allow those companies to go out and to talk to many of you and effectively then raise finance in a structured way where Microsoft then can step away. Hopefully I can take that money, go use it for somebody else. So for me, it's a means with which we use our own assets combined with technology and people knowledge and mentoring and sponsorships and so on. And we're not only focused on the IT industry, we're not only focused on developers, but we're actually focused on business in general. And I think realistically that takes us to something that we've tried to think about, which is the concept of national apps. And I think the way that I would explain this is that you probably count in your hand the number of priorities that governments in Africa have, national priorities. Economic diversification, delivery of primary health care, education, content delivery, agriculture. There's probably few that are so critical that you can actually group them, sometimes regionally and sometimes just by function. And so our thinking is, why doesn't Microsoft actually focus on enabling people to build applications that are relative to the national transformation that governments are trying to do in Africa? Because that then creates a platform where individual application developers, small businesses can come in and either deliver services or consume services on the back of these platforms. So this is the approach that we've taken in terms of enabling innovation. So rather than saying, okay, let's just teach people how to write a phone app, it's actually going a little bit deeper than that and saying, how do we start identifying some partners? This is one of them in Kenya, which is focused on a much broader health solution. But what's coming out of this is then we're finding a whole ecosystem of developers who are now starting to build user interface apps, accessibility apps, patient record apps, and then that turns into an identification app. And so what we're starting to see is a multiplication of so many different opportunities. And of course, being in Kenya, they try and tie it to mobile payments, but we need to be careful because those don't work everywhere else in the continent, but that's not important. What's important is to get that momentum. So this is an example of health. School. Some of you will be familiar with President Kenyatta making an announcement a little while ago that he was going to give a device to every child in Kenya. Every child that goes to school will have a device. Well, how many times have we seen these? One laptop, one device, one piece of chalk, one blackboard, it's an endless, nauseating sort of circle of nothing happening and people talking about. And so I think one needs to be very careful because, of course, I think much to my disappointment and many of us, that particular opportunity in Kenya has degenerated into a race to find the cheapest device. Where's the value? Right? Where's the development of a digitally empowered teacher ecosystem that can actually use technology and empower children through technology? Where's the entrepreneurial opportunity for people to support such ecosystems, technology, skills, etc.? It doesn't happen because I think we have a lot of work to do to teach people how to really think about technology. So again, trying to focus on schools. And the third one, of course, as I talked about, is finance. And really, I think it's a tragedy that so little is invested at the grassroots level. And it's tough. You know, I understand venture capital. I understand the process through which due diligence has to be done. And I understand the risk. But again, last night, a nice conversation with Maurizio. The risk is not the technology, right? Technology in Africa is just as bad or good as technology anywhere else in the world. The risk is not Africa. The risk is the business risk. And so the risk is the lack of capacity that exists on the continent to be able to absorb. And I think the development industry has taught us over many years the folly of throwing money at the problem. They've thrown billions and billions of dollars or euros or whatever at Africa and nothing has landed to a significant degree because the capacity of people to absorb that. So I think, again, building young African entrepreneurs and letting them understand, I think, is a better approach. So to close, you know, I've picked 3 applications, 2 of which I think are represented in the room. I think both Jesse and Andrew are here. It's hard for me to see, but and what I wanted to do here was just kind of throw out a couple of questions. So there are amazingly innovative, well used, whether it's Mixit or M-Copa or anything else. For those of you that are not familiar with NowFloats is a really, really interesting app. It takes you 4 text messages and you have what appears to be a website. And consumers can actually access your website. It's a full-blown business website, but you don't even have a data device that can actually allow you to access your website. And when anybody goes to your website and interacts with you, you get a text message. And you respond via text, and the application that NowFloats has built puts it out. And so we are creating websites, web presence for entrepreneurs who are using a feature phone. So I think the level of innovation is phenomenal, right? The level of capability is amazing. Does it matter what platform it lives on? Does it matter which device people are using to access? I don't think so. I don't think it's even relevant. What matters is affordability. So if I can spend $1 a month, and in spending, or for those in South Africa, it's a nice translation, 10 rand, isn't it? It's just perfect symmetry. 1,000 shillings, whatever it is. And have constant access to a service. Not to browse the web, not to go and see what photographs people have put into Instagram, but to actually have access to services that enable me to develop my own business opportunity or take my idea as a young person and start looking for opportunities to raise funding. Do I care whether my phone, is this color or that color, has a big screen or a small screen? It doesn't matter. Right? What matters is, do I have a network that I can be constantly connected to? Is it affordable? And does it have those services that are relevant to me? And so our view is the investment that I think needs to be made from a mobile, fixed line, back end, front end, kiosk, doesn't matter, top of the tree, in the desert, it doesn't matter where it is the investment in enabling the people of Africa to get connected in an affordable way and to have those services that are totally relevant to them constantly available. And I think in doing that, then that digital economy becomes an economy rather than the digital part of it. And I think that for a long time, too many people have focused on the digital piece. So we worry about, all the things I've talked about, but I don't think that that's the issue. And I think I'm fortunate because I've somehow convinced the executives at Microsoft that even though Microsoft lives in a digital world, we need to invest in the economy world because that's actually what's going to make things work. So I'll stop and perhaps take questions or listen to an opinion. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Ferdinand. We have about 10 minutes we'll do a couple of questions before we move on to the next panel. A couple of things that you said really struck home, and I'll jump in with a couple of comments. The bit on the education I think was fascinating because there is this myopic obsession with devices in people's hands. In no ways is that a bad thing.
No, it's not a bad thing.
The thing you were saying about the school administration really struck home. I was very lucky to see one of the Bridge Academy projects in Kisumu, and if anyone doesn't know them, I would look at Bridge International Academies online, and they have a model where the teachers have Nook ebooks, and there's usually one connected device for the school which the principal holds, which in this case in Kisumu was an $80 IDS handset. And I was talking to him about how technology and the fact that the Wi-Fi could get really good teaching materials into the Nook readers for the teachers was fantastic. And he said, yes, but the most valuable thing to him was using M-Pesa via the phone to pay all of the people that supplied stuff to the school, because that meant he wasn't spending days of the week traveling to people and writing stuff out, which meant he could have more time looking at how the teaching was being done in the school. And I think some of that is fascinating to look at. It's not what people traditionally see as using mobiles and technology for education, but that's what actually changes the school, yes. And that's what makes it really impactful.
And if I may, I would add a number of examples that we've seen in the healthcare industry with nurses out in the remote clinics. Most of these people are unbelievably dedicated, conscientious, diligent in what they do. And one of the big tasks that they have to do is, at least once a week, they spend half a day writing their reports. They write down how many patients they saw, what medicine they issued, etc., what prescriptions they filled. And then they travel, sometimes at great expense and time, to a local town or something, and they hand in their report. The report is filed, and what constitutes an amazing source of data, an amazing opportunity to actually analyze what is really happening. So then it ties into supply chain, medicine supplies, intelligence about the health conditions of that environment where the nurse is supporting is essentially filed as a piece of paper because there is no mechanism to, when you introduce technology and the nurse spends 15 minutes keying in the data, she has 4.5 or 5 hours to treat more patients. And so it's again not the technology, it's not even the report, it's not the data, it's the fact that she's doing what she's really ought to be doing, which is to take care of people. And so I think there are many of these such examples, which is where we think that the opportunity for the digital economy really comes into.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So we have time for a couple of questions if anyone has any that they would like to ask or comments on what Fernando was saying.
Miguel. It's a good question. So our view is there's enough curriculum available probably throughout the world without any more having to be written or developed. So, but I think that the mechanism of delivering that curriculum or delivering content across different environmental conditions, be it that the network doesn't exist or there's no electricity and so on, we think is probably the more focused opportunity for us. So we see the money going into opportunities of developing power-enabling solutions, the delivery, the engines through which people can actually consume content and learn rather than necessarily writing the technology or building the content. The last piece is encouraging Africans to create content. And this talks to two aspects of the population. The first one is the hundreds of millions of illiterate Africans who are today not participating in the African economy as much as they could or should. But secondly, and agribusiness is probably a great example of this, the local conditions and what happens in the farming communities is not, that content doesn't exist. Nobody really can understand. So you need to talk about market intelligence and development. But we are so far advanced in comparison to 85% of the population in Africa. So we see that relationship and that investment and the money going towards enabling that part of the economy that isn't yet part of the sort of digital revolution, as it were. Hi.
If I'm not mistaken, you said that you're not doing CSR.
No.
So what is your definition of CSR? And how do you link CSR to business? Because, for instance, and maybe we come to that later in the summit, Orange would think that maybe it's looking like what you're doing. We feel it's CSR.
Right. I think it talks to two things. The first one is the measurement criteria that we use to determine success. Right? Generally, and even within my own organization, CSR is measured as how many millions of dollars of software have you donated, and were you able to prove that all these people are non-for-profit, et cetera, because that's how people see the world. Sorry, did you want to say something?
Yes, that's philanthropy, that's not CSR.
Okay.
CSR is responsible for
Correct. Business, yes. So in doing that, is the organization, the corporation, being responsible to the environment in which it operates? So there are issues around eco-responsibility, preservation of nature, and so on, the green aspects of how we do business. So that is one aspect of it. The way that we look at it, rather than CSR, is saying there's a profit, perhaps, and the real distinction is that there's a profit motive in everything that we invest in. We are measuring return to ourselves as well as to the people that we work with. So,
well, that's a long discussion.
yeah.
I don't see CSR being opposite.
It's not.
No, but I think, and I mean, I'd characterize it slightly different because this is something that we look a lot, because you very much share your perspective in how we work. For me, the difference is scale. And I think your definition and what you do in Orange is very unique in that you do embed it within the business and do look at kind of how that builds out.
Yes, it is different.
For me, why we work primarily at looking at how you make services for operators and our members something that has a key strategic value for them is that's how you reach scale. Is that traditionally, and I think Orange is one of the exceptions, but traditionally a CSR team in an organization may have a small budget, may have a very specific philanthropic role, and does fantastic things, but isn't within the core of the business. I think when you look at how you build sustainable businesses that have a social impact, you're doing things that are genuinely achieving the potential scale that our industries can. And that scale question is the one for me. What is not, do you speak to the CSR team or do you speak to the main team? Who do you need to speak to achieve scale in a market? And that drives kind of who you work with and how you build those businesses.
But having some relationship with Orange, especially in West Africa, I know your CSR work is quite different to, I think, many of the organizations do. Commendable.
Wonderful. So thank you, Fernando. We will move on to the next session. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Chris.